also coming back in July 8th, to talk about hikes, historic hikes in the Massachusetts area. So we're very happy to have her here today, and I'm very happy that you all come out and join us. We learned some interesting things about the small museum. So thank you so much. And I do want to say thank you to the Friends of the Ayer Library for sponsoring this program. We have a calendar of events at the desk, and I have some on the table over here. Please take a look when you go, because we have a lot of really cool stuff coming this couple months, and we appreciate the Friends for putting that together for us. So thank
If you want to go out there with Evie, you can.
Yeah, before I forget, very first thing I should say is if there's a museum you're interested in going to, check with your library for a pass, because they are a wonderful resource when it comes to getting you out to as many museums and other locations, interesting places as you're interested in going this summer. I recently published this little book, 50 Memorable Museums in Massachusetts, as part of this whole project. As I was just saying, I have put together a spreadsheet of over 250 museums in Massachusetts. Now that is pretty broad because it includes a lot of historic homes, and sometimes libraries have museums, not necessarily anything that small, but something worth going to. 250 locations. So 50 in my little book is just scratching the surface. I tried to break out at least 20. If I talk quick, you can get all 20 of them tonight. But I tried to break out 20 just to show you some of the variety and maybe start you on your own adventure of discovery of all of the wonderful places we have in Massachusetts. And the question begins, what is a museum? Is a historic home in and of itself a museum? Well, it kind of depends on how it's presented. Is a historic site a museum if it doesn't have a building, if there's no real collection to it? Again, there are so many ways to define it. Why do we go to museums? Well, to educate yourself, to entertain yourself when you have some free time. They often have air conditioning in summer. We were just talking about a museum that last weekend was like 30 degrees inside. I was freezing. I'll tell you which one that is if you really want it. When you have rainy days during vacation, go to a museum, entertain yourself, be inspired. It doesn't mean you have to paint like this master who developed these gorgeous paintings here in the room, but just some sort of creative, artistic inspiration. And of course, culture. In Massachusetts, we've got to get our culture in. So it means learning, always learning and experiencing new things and exposing yourself to new and different ways of looking at the world. And the project included my mom. You'll see her in a lot of the pictures. We started about 3 years ago because I was working on a book about her family when she was a kid, and I needed as much information as I could. Now, Mom recently turned 90, so getting her to talk about things that happened 80, 85 years ago is difficult, but I felt like when we went to museums, she was really, all of her senses were lit up, and she was very engaged. And afterwards, we would have these wonderful conversations about what we saw, and it was much easier to get the information I needed from her because she was so engaged. So you'll see her in a lot of the pictures. Now, as I said, so many filled up my list, over 250. It still blows my mind to think about it. Fine art museums, history museums, nature museums, textile museums, galleries, military history, social history, and then I found out there was a beer can museum that I hadn't even been to. That's down in the Middleborough area. So let's start on the South Shore. In the town of Plymouth, where I lived for many years, Right on Court Street is a museum that's familiar to a lot of people who grew up in Massachusetts, the Pilgrim Museum, also called Pilgrim Hall Museum, because it's a place that all of us went on school field trips to learn about the Pilgrims. Now, they tend to tell people and try to impress on people that they're one of the oldest museums in the country. And they are one of the oldest museums in the country, but they are not the oldest museum. In 1832, they were preceded by more than 50 years by the Charleston Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, which has a large collection and is still open. So I think Charleston Museum opened in like 1774, before the American Revolution. Pretty amazing. And museums go back even further than that. There were some in Europe in the 1600s that were open to the public. One in Rome that I read about. And well before that, in about 400 AD, there was a museum in Mesopotamia. You think, what would they even have there? You know, papyrus scrolls or something? But so the Pilgrim Hall Museum is one of our oldest in the country, certainly one worth investigating. It started with the collection of objects that were gathered by people who came over on the Mayflower. So they are actual objects from the Mayflower voyage, which makes it very interesting. I am especially impressed with the Eliot Bible that's on display there, which was a typical King James version of the Bible, translated word for word into the Wampanoag language. So this was to convert the Native Americans way back in the 1600s and turn them into what they used to call praying Indians. And so that is an artifact that you can only see a couple places in the country, including the Smithsonian, but we have one right here in Plymouth, which is awfully cool. Now, I quibble a bit with this museum because of their rather dogmatic stance that the Pilgrims were the founding fathers of the country, that these brave white men who crossed the ocean came here to, straighten out the natives and show them how to live right and all that sort of thing. And in the Hall of Portraits, which was recently renovated, so this is a picture from the previous iteration, some of the pictures kind of do that quietly. There are these giant, imposing portraits of people looking down at you. And, back in the day when people didn't go to very many museums, I'm sure that really impressed them that, wow, these guys were the real deal. They really were the founding fathers, really reinforced that mythology of these people leading the country. But, that aside, a lot of very interesting artifacts from the Mayflower, a lot of great information about how difficult it was for people to survive when they first arrived here. We think we have tough winters, but try living in an uninsulated shack, down on the seashore. So the Pilgrim Museum is definitely worth a visit. And one thing that they're doing that is absolutely fascinating is that they're starting to sort of blend the new understanding of Native American civilization here in America with the coming of the Pilgrims in a tapestry, a hand-stitched tapestry that will blend both stories together. When it is completed, there will be 120 feet of hand-stitched tapestry, sort of retelling the story of the Pilgrims' arrival in a more modern light, so that it's a little more acceptable to folks who understand it holistically. So the next visit is out in Webster, almost directly south of here. Webster was not even a town when Samuel Slater built a mill there back in the 1820s. Samuel Slater was the father of the Industrial Revolution in America. He was actually an Englishman who came across the ocean as a teenager with the knowledge of the English and Scottish millworks in his head. He memorized all of how it worked, the gearing and everything. He basically stole corporate secrets and snuck back to the United States, where he could then put them to their highest and best use and actually make money off of it. So he made mills with a series of partners all the way up the Blackstone River, starting in Rhode Island. So he's somewhat more associated with Woonsocket and Pawtucket, where some of his mills are still historical sites in the Blackstone River. But he eventually landed in what is now Webster, built his last greatest mill, and he had so many employees that he actually had the state of Massachusetts create the town of Webster for his mill, which is kind of neat in and of itself. So the story of the Samuel Slater experience that one of the docents told us was that there was a family from Webster, and the daughter, who was in her 30s maybe, was starting a restaurant. And her father said, "What are you gonna call the restaurant?" And she said, "Slater's." And he said, "Huh? Why would you call the restaurant Slater's?" And she said, "Dad, don't you know about Samuel Slater? He's the whole reason that Webster exists." And the father said, "No, I've never heard of him, but somebody should build a museum to him." And then Dad did exactly that. The father of this young woman who was opening the restaurant built a museum to Samuel Slater, and the coolest part is that he brought in the most high-tech way of telling a very old story. He brought in the most advanced museum technology, and when you go in room by room learning about Samuel Slater, you're not looking at dusty artifacts under glass. You're actually getting like holographic actors on screens, and they're talking about, they're in costume, they're speaking like they were in the 1820s and 30s, and they're talking about the mill business, what's working, what's not working, do they have the right supplies, how are the employees doing. You go to the next room and you're in one of the employees' living spaces, and it's the mother talking to the child on the screen, again in costume. It's really immersive, and it is so well done. I just can't say enough. It was truly, out of all of the museums that my mother and I visited, one of our absolute favorites. We would go back to it in a heartbeat. It's only open currently Thursday to Sunday. Another thing that they've done in that museum space is recreated old downtown Webster. They talk a lot about how Webster was such a boom town when the Slater Mill was, up and working. And so they decided to recreate it. You can actually walk into some of these businesses. On the other side of the room, there's this old Worcester and Webster streetcar that you can get on. You can see Mom sitting here on it there. And the whole wall is a movie screen. So you're sitting on the streetcar, watching the scenery go by as if the streetcar is moving down the street. I can't tell you how, we were just so tickled by the experience. It was just a wonderful, wonderful visit. So now we're moving way down the South Shore to the New Bedford Whaling Museum. This is an old favorite. Lots of people have been there at some point, right? But this is one of those museums that you've really got to put your time in to sort of grasp the enormity of it, because it's so much more than just whaling. This museum tackles New England history, manufacturing, many different aspects of New Bedford's history and New England's history at large. It was started back in 1903 by a group of local businessmen who wanted to memorialize the whaling industry. They didn't want it to be forgotten. It was really the economic driver for Massachusetts for decades. So it started with this scale model of the Lagoda, which was a whaling ship owned by Jonathan Bourne, who was a local businessman, a local whaler, obviously. He made in today's dollars like millions, and he only took about 4 or 5 voyages, to catch whales. So it's really amazing how much money could be made in that industry at the time. And as a reminder, of course, they have the whale skeleton hanging over the lobby of the building, and it has been there for many, many years. It still drips oil onto the floor. There's always a bucket under it. More scrimshaw than you can shake a stick at. I was amazed at the size of the whale boats. My mother's a very small person, but can you imagine going out after, say, an 80-foot sperm whale and something that's about 18 to 20 feet long? That's insane. That's completely off the charts. But as I said, other industries are highlighted as well. There was a wonderful glassworks in New Bedford that pretty much matches up with Sandwich glass museum down in Sandwich. As far as the quality and the techniques, it's just gorgeous. Of course, plenty of whaling artifacts, but here's one that I challenge you to find, is the Resolute desk. Now, the Resolute was a British ship that went into the Northwest Passage, or where they believed the Northwest Passage was in Canada. So they thought that they could sail from England straight across through Canada, the Hudson Bay area, and come out over by China and Russia. And they were always looking for the Northwest Passage. There's some great books about it. One that I read is called The Man Who Ate His Boots, because one of the expeditions that went to find the Northwest Passage got stuck in the ice. And the ice was terrifying. 120 men disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to them. And of course, the title of the book, The Man Who Ate His Boots, is self-explanatory if you understand the circumstances. So the boat, the Resolute, was sent to go find that lost expedition, to find any traces of those 120 men. They went out there, they searched for probably more than a year. They came back empty-handed, couldn't find any of them, but the English people treated them as heroes. And the Queen of England was smart. She knew that she could play on this good feeling. And so she had the ship, which was useless at that point, broken up and made 3 high-quality desks out of parts of it. One is in one of the castles in England. I believe it's used by Prince William. One is in the White House. It's the one that little JFK Jr. is peeking out from underneath. And the third one is in the New Bedford Whaling Museum. So that's a super cool little hunt to go on and find that artifact. So here we are closer to Central Mass. I'm sure lots of you have been to the Icon Museum in Clinton. It used to be called the Russian Icon Museum because the founder, Gordon Langton, was one of the businessmen in the plastics industry in Clinton. And when the Soviet Union changed its stance against American business and against the rest of the world in general, and reopened to business and trading across borders, Mr. Langton would go to Russia frequently to do business in the plastics industry, and he started to find these amazing carvings and paintings that were for sale everywhere, and he recognized that they were pretty unusual, pretty interesting, started to collect them and bring them home. And over time, he amassed quite a collection that became the Icon Museum. Now they are all religious icons, so you're not going to see a lot of variety in genre anyway. And the style of painting, they use the egg tempera paint, which almost makes the paintings glow from within. It gives them this aura. that is so neat to stand close to. It's a little spooky, I have to say. But if you get one of the audio guides and go around, you understand more about the collection and where these items came from and what their importance was to Russian families whose religion was banned during communism. So they weren't allowed to actually practice religion. They had these items in their homes that they would remember their spiritual traditions. But over time, they fell out of favor, and now people are getting rid of them, or they were back in the 90s, and Mr. Langton collected them and made this museum. The museum has a lot of symposiums, a lot of opportunities to learn more and visit and learn from experts who will explain things to you about them. They also do art classes. They do tempera painting classes. I just saw it was an 8-week session, quite a commitment. They have done Ukrainian Easter egg decorating, which is really neat. They're free the first Sunday of every month. Good to know. Also, check with the library for a pass. And before I forget, there's an organization called the Highland Street Foundation, which every summer does a whole series of free museum days. I mean, I think it's every Friday for the entire month of August, and maybe even a little bit more than that, because I saw at April Vacation Week, they had some museum days that they, have the museums open for free to the public, just, out of the goodness of their hearts. So next, a favorite of mine up in Adams, Mass. Who has been to Mass Mocha? Isn't it the most incredible place you've ever been? I just love it. I tell everybody, if you get a chance, you've got to go. It is a long day. It's a long, long drive. But this former manufacturing site is just a model for so many communities. What you can do with old buildings. In the 1850s and 60s, this mill made fabric for the Civil War soldiers to wear. After that, it was sprayed electric, and they did little electrical components that were used by the military in like guided missiles and bombs and things like that. Spray went out of business probably close to 30 years ago, and everyone was like horrified. What is going to happen to the town without this center of business and jobs? It was scary. And a few folks stepped forward with a brilliant, but you have to understand, kind of out there idea. We think this should be a modern art museum. And people were like, here? And it was like, I don't know, 24 buildings. Modern art museum is going to fill all of this? Well, they did. And it is so cool. I have people in my audiences, when I talk about this, raise their hand and say, we took our kids there 20 years ago and the family still talks about it. Because the stuff you see is so unique and magical. That's what it is, it's magical. They pair the spaces with these enormous tall ceilings and giant manufacturing floor, size areas with artists and say, hey, what are you going to do with all of this room? And I can just imagine some of them, whoa, I could come up with something really cool. Enormous installations that are, again, very immersive because you're literally walking through them. This particular artist, this is no longer there, but when I visited, E.J. Hill was given this giant manufacturing space and decided, where better to build a roller coaster. No, it's not just a pink roller coaster handmade. It's a pink roller coaster that museum visitors could get on and ride around the room. How cool is that? In this picture over here, my sweetheart John is standing there in an exhibit where a hard of hearing artist was given a tremendous amount of space to, again, do as they saw fit, and decided to use all of those little notes that they passed back and forth with friends, with waiters, with doctors, to communicate in ways that we take for granted because we have the, ability to hear. So it was, again, a very immersive experience to go into these rooms covered with all of these notes and realize on a day-to-day basis, that's their reality. And it's really mind-expanding, I have to say. Again, 24 buildings, long hallways, you gotta wear comfortable shoes, get a map. There is a cafe, there's a beer garden on site so that you can get some refreshments and take your time and see the whole thing. Where else are you gonna climb some industrial stairs to get into an Airstream trailer that is positioned 2 stories above the ground and is filled with artifacts from the Cold War? Where else is that gonna happen? So that's Mass Mocha out in Adams, and just a gem, and absolutely worth the trip. Oh, and they have lots of musical events and special events. If you get on their website, start getting the emails and find out when you want to go visit. So now we're going to the opposite end of the state, to the Cape Ann area, to Newburyport Customs House Museum. Now this is a fairly small museum. I always recommend take the docent tour, because I could have gone in there and just read the little cards on the shelves and sort of come away with some information. But I was lucky to go in at a time where there was a docent available, someone who knows the collection very well, knows the history very well, and took me room by room and made the connections between different items so that I really understood the history involved. And the Customs House Museum was a creation of Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was looking for ways to fund the federal government, way back in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And he came upon the idea of taxing goods that were coming into the country, goods that were coming off of ships. Newburyport is on the Merrimack River. It was a major port back in that era. And so the goods that came by ship and were offloaded into Newburyport were weighed and measured with a lot of the items, including this giant barrel, and taxed accordingly, according to the quantity, the volume. And so they have a lot of artifacts of that time, but also it made me understand how the trajectory of Newburyport's history was affected by it, because when the administration changed in Washington and this customs house fell out of favor and was closed, all of a sudden Newburyport's economy was going down the tubes, because they no longer had these people coming in doing all of the offloading and weighing and measuring and collecting the taxes and all that stuff. But it also claims to be the birthplace of the US Coast Guard. And that's because the Coast Guard began as an arm of the Treasury Department. And it was really their job to check ships in and to check their cargoes. And over time, it morphed into what they do now in protecting the coast. So it's a cool little museum, and Newburyport is a fabulous town to visit. If you haven't been, Yankee homecoming weekend at that's probably mid-August. Really a big time to visit the town, lots going on, lots to see, beautiful place to go. Now we're on Cape Cod, another maritime museum, in downtown Hyannis, right next to the marina in downtown, the docks. And one of the first things that impressed me was as a sailor, I know that Cape Cod has shoals, has shallow water, can be kind of dangerous for ships. But this is an actual drawing of 3 large ships all beached at once because they washed up on the shoals. And that was the reality of Cape Cod for centuries. You know, that they didn't have the navigational equipment to stay far enough offshore when there was bad weather or to have weather forecasts. So the Maritime Museum is centered around many of these things like the breeches buoy, which when a ship foundered in shallow water and began to list, they would shoot a line into the rigging and then run this big canvas barrel. It's like a canvas barrel that would run on a pulley out to the ship. People could get into it and be hauled back to safety, and then they would send it out again and back and forth. And so they have pictures of it there. They have an actual Coast Guard surfman's badge. The surfmen back then used to literally be the actual first responders because they would walk up and down the beaches looking for the ships that were in trouble. They didn't, you couldn't wait for the phone call to come or for someone to call on their VHF radio that, hey, I'm in trouble, Mayday, come get me. It was a matter of finding them. So they also talk a little bit about the wreck of the Portland, which is the subject of an interesting local book called Cape Cod and the Portland Gale of 1898. Again, no weather forecasting. The Portland was a regular steamship that went from Cape Cod up north. I think they were heading for Portland, Maine. And they wrecked in a terrible storm. No one knew the ship was missing. And over 100 people were killed in that one incident. So, interesting history of Cape Cod. If you haven't read The Outermost House by Henry Beston, this is a very old book. I think it was written in the 40s or 50s, but such cool history of living in a dune shack on Cape Cod and sort of watching the seasons pass and watching many of the Coast Guard surfmen pass up and down the beaches on their daily tours of duty. Again, lots of scrimshaw. I mean, I look at these and I say, who needs an iPhone with your girlfriend's picture if you can have a carved tooth, right? Or who needs to send a postcard home when you can carve the scene on a sperm whale tooth? It's amazing what they did with their spare time. Sometimes I wonder, when all of our screens are done and over with, what will we have to show for our lives, right? If we're not on our phones, I can't carve scrimshaw. Well, another thing that they have at the Cape Cod Maritime Museum in Hyannis are lots of examples of local boats made for the conditions on Cape Cod, which are high tides and shallow water. So many of them are shallow draft. They have oars and sails so that you can get in and out for fishing or hunting ducks or what have you in those big tidal areas of the Cape. They also build a lot of boats on site. So when I was there, they had a group of young boys, like Cub Scout age, learning how and literally hands-on helping to build a boat in that workshop, which is pretty cool. Makes the museum more part of the community. Now back to the South Shore again, Fall River Maritime Museum. I'm afraid I didn't have as many nice things to say about Fall River Maritime Museum, and I hope they excuse me, but there are some very interesting things there. It's part of Battleship Cove, so you can get a double ticket to see the Maritime Museum and go on the USS Massachusetts and the other ships there that are under the Braga Bridge, Route 195 bridge. The museum itself, unless you really, really want to learn about these steamships, you might not spend the time in there. But the steamship history was really very interesting to me. I'm easily interested. I love to go on these little imaginary journeys in museums and learn about new things. And I never knew that from 1897 to 1937, there was an enormous business of steamship travel that originated in Fall River. And there was a whole fleet of these steamships that would go down to Newport, Rhode Island, to New York City, up to Portland, Maine, and many different destinations. And so in the museum, they have models of them, they have recreated staterooms, they describe what the journey was like, and I'm like, kicking myself. My grandparents traveled in luxury and style. I mean, you would get on the ship in Fall River, have a sumptuous meal on real china in your stateroom, go to bed, wake up in the morning, and have breakfast maybe out on the veranda as New York City is coming into view. And I'm buying tickets on, Spirit Airlines, suffering. But so little things like that. Unfortunately, in 1937, the steamship business absolutely ground to a halt, very unexpectedly, left lots of people out of work. And then the poor people of Fall River had to witness all of these ships literally falling to pieces at the piers. They just rotted away in place, they're never to be used again. It is a location that has some Titanic memorabilia because it's very close to Woods Hole, where Dr. Ballard went out and actually discovered the Titanic. They have the scale model from the 1958 movie, A Night to Remember. And I will get back to the Titanic theme in just a second. I want to touch on very briefly the Marconi Maritime Museum out in Chatham, way down on the Cape, which was the first intercontinental communication station in the United States. They could communicate with ships at sea between Europe and the United States in Chatham, and that was the only spot where you could do that. So they would transmit the daily news to people crossing the ocean on ships, and of course it was one of the first places to hear about shipwrecks. In World War II, and I've written a couple of World War II books about German submarines. In World War II, they were partially responsible for being able to triangulate German submarines' positions out at sea by listening to their radio transmissions. So it helped us eventually turn the tide of the war. The German submarines were terrible in sinking so many ships on the East Coast. They sunk, in 1942, 170 American ships on the East Coast just in the first 4 months of the war. They were absolutely just picking us off right and left. And the Marconi Maritime Museum has the equipment that they used to find those submarines, and they have volunteers who will actually demonstrate how it was used. They still can run the old radio triangulation equipment and that sort of thing. So now I'm zipping way back out here to the Springfield neighborhood of Indian Orchard in Springfield. And I said I would get back to the Titanic thing, and this is just a really fun, teeny tiny little museum. I had heard about it, I had it on my list. One day my mother and I were in the car and we went to a couple of museums, and I said, okay, let's try and get to this one before it closes. It closes at 5. So I put it in my GPS. We floored it, got out there into Springfield, and of course my GPS is saying you have arrived. And I'm like, what do you mean I've arrived? I don't see a museum. I see a jewelry store. But in the window of the jewelry store is this little tiny sign that says Titanic Historical Society. And I thought, oh, is someone pulling one over on me? Really? Was it worth driving all the way out of here? So we went into the jewelry store, and in the midst of the usual cards and gifts that you find in a place like that is this giant replica of the Titanic. And so we looked at it, and we walked around it, and you could see the expression on my mother's face, like, is this it? There was a lady behind the counter, and I said, is this the museum? And she said, oh, you came for the museum? And I said, yes. And she said, well, that'd be $7. So we paid her $7. Come back behind the counter with her and into her back room. And the museum was back there. It's no bigger than this room. It's dusty items under glass, but it was a hoot. The woman was the sister of this guy who started the museum. His name was Ed Kamuta. When he was a teenager, back in the 50s, it might have been the movie A Night to Remember, I'm not sure what movie it was, a big Titanic movie came out. Remember in the 1990s when Leonardo DiCaprio came out in the Titanic movie? It was a big deal. Well, back in the 50s, A Night to Remember had the same impact. And Ed Kamuta was just a teenager. He saw the movie and he was just like, whoa, mind blown. He wanted to know everything there was to know about the Titanic. And he found out that every movie theater that showed the movie received a brochure that had all of the names and addresses of the surviving Titanic survivors in it. He wrote to every single one of them. And it was 30, 40 years after many of them were still alive, they started to correspond back and forth with Ed. And he showed such interest that when they wanted to get rid of something, you know, who wants this old thing that I wore the night that the Titanic sunk? Well, Ed'll take it. They sent him things like shirts, scarves, cufflinks, you know, little objects like that. But as time went on, he only grew more and more infatuated with the Titanic story. He started a newsletter for people interested in the Titanic, and he updated them on anything that happened. Anytime an anniversary of the Titanic came around, or something happened to one of the survivors, or he got correspondence from a survivor, you know, anything. And it was a subscription newsletter, as we used to do back in the day before email. He turned that into conventions, Titanic conventions, back in the 80s. And he would have the survivors come to the conventions, and there were plenty of people in the world who were blown away to meet these folks and to hear their stories themselves. So over time, he became the de facto Titanic expert in the United States. And when they did make that movie in 1990 with Leonardo DiCaprio, who do you think the director called? This guy. He was actually given a part in the movie. He and his wife were in the movie. He gathered the cast and apparently, allegedly said, "You're all here today because of this guy." What a moment, huh? With all of the tremendous earnings from his newsletter and his conventions, he erected a few monuments to the Titanic situation. I believe that the captain of the Titanic might have been from Springfield. And he had a monument put in the cemetery in Springfield. Of course, the man's body was never recovered. He went down with the ship. But the monument is there, courtesy of Ed Kamuta. His sister is still giving micro tours of the museum. She told us that many of the most treasured artifacts are actually on loan to the Titanic Museum in Branson, Missouri, and a couple of others. So there isn't a whole lot to see, but the experience was unforgettable. It was a hoot. We had a great time and came away from the whole experience thinking like, that was such a great use of our time. You know, it was so fun. So here we are back on Cape Cod again. Sorry if you're getting whiplash. We're still on the maritime theme. The Witta Pirate Museum. Super cool. This is on Route 28 in Barnstable. And I think way back when, there was an aquarium in this building. If anyone remembers back that far, thank you. I don't feel that old then. The Witta Pirate Museum is based on an actual pirate treasure recovered off of Cape Cod. Actual pirate treasure. The Witta was the slave ship carrying the golden doubloons So a really legit pirate treasure being doubloons. And the first thing you see when you go in is the ship's bell, because the identity of the ship was unknown to the people who discovered it and started to recover some of the artifacts until they found the bell. They had suspicions that it was the Witta, but it wasn't really well documented. Actually, nobody else knew it was there. It was a fishing captain who, using his fish finder, you know, if you're familiar with that, it sort of does sonar on the bottom of the ocean. He was off of P-Town somewhere on the outer Cape and was using his fish finder and came across, you know, this unusual sort of topography and went back to it and did a little investigation and thought, I think that's a shipwreck. I think that's an old shipwreck. And then went through the documents, couldn't find any documentation of it, thinking, well, maybe it's a really old shipwreck. And that was the basis of this entire museum. It's all based on that one ship, but found locally, which I think makes it so neat. They do a lot of things in this museum, all centered on piracy, pirates. They explain piracy down to every crossed T and dotted I. The period of piracy was actually much shorter than we would believe, having seen all of the pirate movies, right? It didn't last very long. There weren't very many really, you know, high-powered pirates who were making a lot of money. It was really a pretty miserable life to live. But when they did, they had a good time, apparently. So there's a lot of explanation about the pirates in the museum. There is a science aspect to it that shows what they actually find on the ocean floor. And then when they x-ray it and find out what's inside all of those barnacles and all of that growth, and then the decision, do we try to extricate this old gun from this piece of, you know, marine life here, or do we leave it? So they have an entire room that's just dedicated to the science behind the shipwrecks. There is also a small, you know, model ship. If you have kids, they can go climb on it and pretend like they're pirates. And finally, when you're walking out of the building, you get to see the gold doubloons, which is so neat because they hammer it into your head. This is the only pirate movie anywhere that you can see in a public place. You know, it's just, there's a lot of legends, there's a lot of myths, but they have the real deal right there on Cape Cod. Well worth a vacation day visit. It is a little pricey to get in, and they also don't take any sort of reciprocal museum passes or anything like that. So I think it was probably $20 a piece. Back in Central Mass, so we are, I believe, in Worcester Art Museum, probably familiar to many of you. I'm happy to say that much of the museum recently had a facelift. So these are old pictures. You know, they didn't do anything to the John Singer Sargents or, you know, their fabulous artwork, but they have refreshed much of the interior of the building, which goes hand in hand with receiving and putting the Higgins Armory collection on display. So they have been working on the Higgins Armory collection for several years, restoring all of that hardware with an expert, and now it has its own gallery, which is super cool because if you remember the Higgins Armory itself was such a neat place to visit. It was like going into a castle with all of those knights in their hardware. They also have the Flora and Winter exhibit every March. They have floral designers replicate artwork in flowers. Really a fun visit because, you know, at that point in the winter, your eyes are so thirsty to see color. You're like dying to see things in color. Everything seems to fade to sort of black and white and gray in the wintertime. But you go into the museum for that exhibit, it's like, oh, I remember what that looks like. That's gorgeous. So they have lots of old masters. They have more modern paintings. It's really a super museum, and it has parking. You don't have to go all the way to Boston. I will say that the last time I borrowed a museum pass from a library and went, it took the price down a little bit, but it was still a little, a little painful. So it's a little expensive, but I have to say for a really high quality museum experience that you don't have to travel all the way into Boston for, it's worth it. Again, more of a Flora in Winter exhibit. I thought this was a cool juxtaposition of Mom and the carving. And then they have some American favorites. This is Hicks' Peaceable Kingdom, something that's familiar to many of us. This gentleman's name was Edward Sauvage. He was from Worcester. He painted his family members. And I always like to go remind myself, we giggle about this picture because everyone is way out of proportion. He starts with probably a normal size and proportion person, but then they get tinier and tinier until he couldn't even paint their hands because they had shrunken so much. So he just put a big table in front of the whole thing to sort of cover it up. Yet, the painter, Edward Sauvage, went on to paint George Washington's family. So, if you stick to your art and you practice, you can succeed. And I love this little painting. I learned a lot going to so many museums. And one thing that I learned is that back in the early 1800s, itinerant painters would travel around the countryside with a partially finished portrait, minus the head. And they would come to what looked like wealthy homesteads and say, "Sir, may I paint your daughter?" And therefore, you go into museums and you see these paintings, they always look off, just a little bit, like the head just doesn't quite fit the body. And that's what it was. That's a piece of New England history right there. Crazy as it may be. Okay, let's see, how are we doing? Good. Danforth Museum in downtown Framingham, right off of Route 9, is a long-time Framingham institution, moved closer to Framingham State. Now they call it Framingham State University, off of Route 9. And they do a lot of teaching, a lot of art classes, but they also have a juried exhibit every year that just knocked my socks off. I unfortunately have had this sort of prejudice, having grown up in that area, thinking, what's this museum gonna show me anything, Here I am, an art snob, completely uneducated. I went in there and my jaw dropped. Their juried exhibit was stunning. And a lot of the artists were fairly local. They're Massachusetts people, and I'm like, wow, that means there are lots of people that I walk by or drive by every day who have superpowers to create this incredible art. This was an entire tea set made out of wool that somebody put together. It was really neat. This picture of the woman there is a statue. It's a very good allegory or comparison of what being a woman is like. There's so many pieces to you. And I want to mention Meta Vo Warwick Fuller was a local artist, actually a sculptor trained in Paris. And she was an African-American sculptor who lived in Framingham for most of her life and practiced her art in the attic of her home, sculpting African-American people. And at that time, that was so unusual. And Danforth has her entire collection on site. They often put portions of it out on exhibit, but just someone worth learning about. She was well ahead of her time. So again, Mom looks so confused looking at this model woman here. She's like a puppet. just the quality of the artwork stunned me, and I can't wait to go to their next jury exhibit. So where's the star? Cape Cod again, here we go, more art. And I promise you, if you take a look at the book, it's not all art museums, many history museums. I guess I just kind of got on a roll. I did many maritime museums, now many art museums. Down on Katuitt, on Route 28 around the Mid-Cape, is the Cahoon Museum of American Art, and brought to us by Martha and Ralph Cahoon, who lived in this tiny little house on the side of Route 28 back in like the 20s and 30s. And they were just getting by, painting early American style, almost like stencil work on furniture. So they weren't highbrow artists of any sort. They were just trying to sell art to pay their bills, basically. And they even have a few receipts hanging in the art museum that show how close to the bone they lived. But then at some point, Ralph here got a wild hair and decided he was going to go off on his own, and he started to paint very whimsical scenes with mermaids flirting with sailors. And I think in this picture, one of the mermaids, her tail is hooked by a fisherman, and she's sort of spitting water at him. They became wildly popular. And all of a sudden, the Cahoons were, making quite a lot more money. They started to collect art on their own. So when they passed away, they left their home as an art museum, their own collection there on site, and the association that runs it built on another wing. So they have revolving exhibits. This artist, Sarah Peters, was originally from Cape Cod, has recently moved to New York City, but several of her outdoor sculptures are on display across the Cape. Mostly people take a look at this and just crack up. I mean, Wonder Woman as a teapot with such an expression on her face, boredom. There was also, when we were there, Rhode Island School of Design students had an entire exhibit in this new wing that was just incredible. So worth a stop. Oh, and they have a fabulous, really noteworthy museum shop. Very unusual, different little gifts. Worth going, totally worth going. When you're on the Cape, where are we now? Here's one, the most famous sculptor you've probably never heard of, Cyrus Dallin. Anyone heard of him? Does anyone recognize Paul Revere on horseback? The North End across from the Old North Church, right? Well, Cyrus Dallin was an up-and-coming young artist back in the early 1900s when there was an art competition announced to memorialize Revere. And he was only like 23 years old when he won that competition with this model, with Revere on horseback, looking so alive and so full of energy and rebellion, looking like he is ready to lead the country into war. And winning this art competition turned the Boston art world on its head. People were like, who is this young upstart? Who said he could win this competition? He's a nobody. There were a lot of very famous artists in Boston. And this guy comes out of nowhere at a very young age and wins. And so people started taking notice even back then. Unfortunately, it was 40 years before they actually put the statue in the North End. So he had to wait a little while, but he stayed busy. He made statues of Governor Bradford. Is anyone familiar with the Angel Moroni on the top of every Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints temple in the world? I was in Argentina last fall, and we're driving down the highway. I'm like, there it is! It's like, I've seen it in Arlington. I've seen it in, and here is the model in this tiny museum. And when I say tiny, this museum takes maybe 45 minutes if you read everything and go through it twice. but lots of his models for his sculptures, a lot of history. He did the Appeal to Heaven, the Native American on horseback outside the Museum of Fine Arts, where he's leaning back like this. When you see his sculptures, you understand why he was a great sculptor, because even the small models look so alive, like they could get up and walk away, you know? So that's in Arlington, right where the bikeway entrance is. If you're familiar with downtown Arlington, there is parking. There is some parking in a dedicated lot right behind the building, but it's like this tiny little Cape Cod house in a little park-like setting right in the middle of downtown. Fun place to visit. And they're open on Sunday afternoons. That's how we ended up going. We were kind of like, we didn't get to a museum this week, darn it. Wait a minute, there's one that's open on Sundays, let's go. Never regretted that. So down in the Brockton-Taunton area is the Fuller Craft Museum, actually Brockton. It's a textile museum. You know, it's a type of sculpture, right? Soft sculpture, where people make things out of fabric and out of household items, really. We went a second or third time recently, and there was an entire button exhibit where one collector who had amassed an incredible collection of buttons had applied them to bathtubs and aprons, and you name it, everything was just buttonized. So textiles have many different forms. This artist here has redone the entire cast of The Wizard of Oz as soft dolls. Super neat to see and to think, you know, it was just, our reaction to this museum is, it makes it look fun to make art, you know? Not like it's work, but like these people are having fun. They're being so creative. How about a dog satchel made out of leather, you know? This red dress is internationally famous. The artist made the skirt out of many different pieces that they sent around the world to many different communities and invited the women in those communities to embellish their piece of the skirt in whatever way they saw fit. And then the artist collected all of those pieces again and created the dress so that it represents the entire world of women. And, you know, that was just so original, so unique. Speaking of unique, I've never seen anything like this anywhere. This installation looked like lichen or a vine crawling up the wall inside the gallery. And we looked at it and we were like, wow, you know, the colors alone were really neat. But when you got really close, as Mom is here, you realize that it's spun pieces of paper, just twirled around into a tight little, like leaf-shaped item, and then, you know, put very carefully in color variations so that it went from dark green to light green to blue to white across the wall. And I mean, the walls are 15 feet high, and it was just spidering all over the place. So again, you know, it's one of those places where you come out feeling inspired, feeling like, okay, maybe I couldn't do that, but, you know, I could appreciate it. Moving up into the Boston area, I'm out of time, I'm actually over time. You want me to keep going? I'll do one or two more. This is an oldie but a goodie. This is the Bunker Hill Museum in Charleston, across the street from the actual Bunker Hill Monument. It is exactly the way I remember it from my 5th grade field trip, exactly. The little dioramas with the soldiers, nobody has a face, you know, that sort of thing. But it was so worth going again. Even though, you know, I know the basics about Bunker Hill and everything. Of course, it is the 250th anniversary, so refreshing my memory wasn't a bad thing. But this time, I went around the room and read all of the information about the building of the monument. And that in itself was an education. That was fascinating to me because other than these little dioramas, it talked a lot about the whys and the hows of building this monument. This was the original monument that was built in memory of one man whose name was Joseph Warren. He was a young doctor from Boston who actually treated some of the victims of the Boston Massacre. And he spoke out against the British monarchy and against, the tyranny of taxation without representation. He was killed at Bunker Hill. And he had so many followers. He was also a Mason, so he was part of the fraternal organization. He had so many people interested in his life, unfortunately, the end of his life, that one museum curator told me that he was the first use of forensic dentistry. They found his body buried in a grave at Bunker Hill and identified him through fillings that Paul Revere had created, and moved his body, built the original Bunker Hill monument in his memory, but then it became rebuilding the monument bigger and better than ever from donations from local people. And it really crossed the line between actually people wanting to give to the building of the monument and sort of being held up by the locals who said, if you're a patriot, if you want to be an American, you will give us money for this monument. So they were really squeezing people for donations and making them feel like, if you pay us to help build the monument, then we will include you more equally in the community. So very, very interesting stuff to learn there. And I will wrap it up with this one, which is the American Heritage Museum in Hudson. Has anyone been to this one? Very interesting. Now, as a World War II author, I was dying to get in here, dying to get in. I was blown away by the size of the collection. Of course, it is the Collins Foundation, plus the collection of a man from the West Coast named Jacques Littlefield. Jacques Littlefield. They brought it together. It's a very new museum. It's very well done, except I felt that the human element was really, really missing, like sorely missing in this museum. That you have a lot of hardware, and some of the hardware has cool stories too, like the tank that broke through the ice in Poland, went to the bottom of the river, and was not recovered for 50 years, and it was in pristine condition, and it's the only one of its type. Oh, that's kind of cool. But to me, it's the human stories that make the history come alive, so to speak. And there's not so much of this, except there are lots of exceptions in my program. This was incredible. They have recreated an actual portion of the Hanoi Hilton from Vietnam, and they project POWs on the inside of the building, having them talk about their time when they were incarcerated and tortured in that building. So to actually have part of the Hanoi Hilton in Hudson, it gave me goosebumps. Now, I was a young kid during Vietnam. I don't remember a lot of it, but I've read a lot and I've met some survivors. This is completely unique and just very, very well done. Unfortunately, you can't just get to the Hanoi Hilton and skip the rest of the museum. I wouldn't recommend skipping it, but they do have docents who circulate throughout the museum and talk about the different pieces and talk about history, and that is super valuable. But I feel like it could be a very uneven experience, because if you don't have the good fortune to connect with a docent who is talking about something that you want to hear about, it might not, work for you. But for the parts of the museum that you can just go in and see on your own, it is a unique collection. It's an exhaustive collection. And they have many, many outbuildings as well, full of airplanes and other equipment from the war. They have demo days where they're driving the tanks across the field in the back. They take people up in the B-24 bombers for rides. So it's a very busy museum, but it is what it is. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Does anyone have a question, comment, correction? I'm open to it all. No?
Did designers get to see the Paul Revere sculpture installed in the
Yes.
event?
Yes.
Because it took so long.
Right. He was in his 20s when he won the competition. It was 40 years later, so he was in his 60s. Yeah, he did. Question?
If I can plug a local museum,
Oh, please.
Fort Devens Museum. It's up the road here.
I haven't been there yet.
Please come visit. We're open on Friday. I'm on the board.
Okay.
We'd love to have you. And you know, I'd like to think we're a much smaller, like that in a teapot.
Oh, really?
Not the vehicles. We don't have
Okay.
the vehicles because we don't have the space.
Sure. Yeah, it's been on my list for the longest time. But, you know, it's a matter of matching up timing.
We're only open Tuesdays and Fridays and third Saturdays. So yes, that's difficult.
Right, that's the tough part of so many volunteer-led museums.
Yeah.
But, you know,
But we're
I
on
can't-
street.
Oh, that's wonderful. I can't say enough about the people that I've met at the museums throughout the state. So dedicated, so enthusiastic, so willing to share what they know, you know, their excitement and their education. It's been a fabulous trip for me to do this program and to do the little book that I did. So thank you all for coming and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
And I'll be back.